It's a great book. Congratulations. And I have to tell you, I feel a bit like a member of the Gluck family.
Yeah.
Your nephew is my executive producer.
Yeah.
And obviously your sister I know well. I've met her many times. So
Yeah.
I'm like a member of the family.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, I have the book right here. I obviously read it. I wrote a blurb for it. I loved it. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I mean, you're a writer, so it's not that surprising that you decided to write a book about this. And yet I imagine at the same time, I mean, this is such a personal book. It's so candid, obviously, about your life and your health and your view of the world, frankly, and how you look at things. What did you want to convey to readers with this book?
I was diagnosed, some 21 plus years ago now, and I had read my share of other cancer memoirs, some of which are fantastic, and others of which, maybe weren't what I was hoping to do someday. So I had kind of a sense of the landscape. And one of the things I felt I hadn't seen a lot of was somebody talking about the non-medical aspects, the way that cancer affects really every part of your life. Not just your physical health, but your mental health, your relationships, your marriage, your career, your finances, your kids. And I really wanted to share that perspective with others because over the years when I'd talked about those aspects of my experience, as opposed to just the TikTok of my medical journey, those were the things that people were more interested in. So I always had it in mind that if I wrote a book about it someday, I'd really want to focus on those factors so that other people can see that they're not alone in going through this kind of thing and that it's not as easy as everybody, it's harder than people think in those respects, not just the medical.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it is fair to say that I think people think it's hard, right? I mean, if they hear your story and they think 38 years old, just started a new family, you have this hip pain, like most people, you think, hey, look, it's hip pain. I slipped, I probably injured my hip. And then it turns into this whole other thing. And I think for a lot of people, there is a shock to that. And yet at the same time, I have found, just as a physician, talk to my patients, we often go into sort of procedural mode. Like, what am I going to do now? Okay, now that the shock part of it's worn off. But I do want to just sit on this time period for a second when you first, even before you get the diagnosis, you have hip pain that doesn't go away. And just given that the book is all about uncertainty, like I'm just want to capture your thinking at these various times. So before you get a diagnosis, when you have hip pain, how certain or uncertain are you that this is something more? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so the story is I walked out of my office one night in November of 2002, and I slipped on the ice. And I didn't even fall, wasn't a big slip, I just sort of twisted my hip a bit. And I woke up the next morning and it hurt quite a lot. And I thought to myself, at that time I was 37, and I thought, oh, maybe I'm just getting older, it's when these things start to happen, you pull a muscle more easily or you tweak a ligament or something. And I just figured it would go away. And a few weeks went by and it didn't go away. And so I saw my orthopedist and he took an x-ray, didn't see anything, gave me a physical therapy prescription and sent me on my way. Then all kinds of things happened. My wife and I bought our first apartment. I got a new job, a very demanding job. We had our daughter that following spring in April, our first child, my daughter AJ. And so, my hip still hurt, but I was not really taking it seriously. I had too many other things to do, too many other things on my mind. And as I say, I had no history of cancer. I had no risk factors particularly. And frankly, one of the interesting things about this is the idea that it was something more serious than a minor orthopedic problem literally never crossed my mind. It was just inconceivable to me at the time.
Even though it was a year or so of persistent pain.
So then you put your finger on the magic word. The year anniversary came up, so to speak, and I noticed, gosh, this was last November, now it's November of 2003, and my hip still hurts. And that's when a little bit of an alarm went off of like, okay, that's not right. Something's wrong here. It's not going to resolve itself. I've got to go back to the doctor. That's when I went back to my orthopedist. This time he took an MRI. And his office contacted me and they said, Dr. Weiner would like you to come in to talk about your test results. And I thought to myself, well, how amazing, in this day and age, a doctor, no offense, was kind enough to call me in to talk face to face about my results instead of sending me something through an app or, well, there weren't apps at that time, but through email or phone call. And so I went in sort of happily thinking like, okay, worst case here, we're going to need some surgery or something. And he's going to get me back on track. When I got to the office, that's when I knew immediately something was wrong. The receptionist had a very grave air about her when she heard me say who I was to check in. And she turned over her shoulder and looked at the physician's assistant, who immediately took me into the examination room, no waiting room. And I thought something's up here. And then my doctor came in moments later and sat down and said, I need to tell you there's a lesion on your hip. And again, I was so not expecting this. I literally, said, a lesion, is that a tumor? I didn't know the difference. And he said, essentially, yes. And I said, does that mean I have cancer? And he said, yes. And my first reaction, and you're absolutely right about this sort of procedural mode, but my first reaction before I even got there was just pure denial. I mean, the words out of my mouth, first words were literally no, 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 no. I think I said it 5 times, maybe 6. This can't be happening. I'm 38 years old. I have a baby girl, just moved into a new apartment. I don't feel sick otherwise. It's impossible. And unfortunately, it was possible.
I'm sorry you went through that. I just human to human, I think we go through our lives hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. I think we're around the same age as I mentioned, and I sort of try and transport myself back to that time in my life, right when I had my kids. And it's tough. It's tough. And I think for anybody listening out here, part of the reason I wanted to have people listen to you is because a lot of people go through this, if not themselves, then with their loved ones. And I think it's so instructive the way that you sort of approach things, not just in terms of the medical care, but in terms of how you psychologically thought about things. Ultimately, you get a diagnosis, and the diagnosis is multiple myeloma. What do they tell you about the prognosis with that?
One of the interesting things I learned and had no idea about, why would I have prior to this diagnosis, was it took a long time to get a diagnosis. Many cancers are extremely complex. There are subtypes and subtypes of the subtypes. Many symptoms and even lab results overlap. So it took them several months. It's a very complicated array of tests to reach a definitive diagnosis. That's when they decided I had multiple myeloma, and only then was I directed to the appropriate specialist, a hematologic oncologist.
Right.
To answer your question more directly, when I saw him, he's a wonderful guy, became one of my physicians for many years. And he was frank and told me that, when we got around to me asking him directly about a prognosis, he said, you might have as little as 1.5 years to live. But I would expect in your case, because you're young and otherwise healthy, you'd do better than that. So maybe we're looking at 3 to 5 years, which was, not a very happy thing to hear. At the same time, he said, but I really want you to know that there are a ton of new drugs in the pipeline for what you have for multiple myeloma. And even though I know you're probably feeling unlucky to have this at all, I'm telling you, you're actually coming into this at a time when, luckily, there are a lot of new treatments on the horizon. And frankly, between you and me, I just thought he was sort of blowing smoke to make me feel a little better, give me a little hope. But that's exactly what turned out to be the case, is there have been an astonishing number of developments, not just in overall the treatment of many different cancers, but in particular for multiple myeloma, that have very literally kept me alive.
You're a writer. You're a wordsmith. I am curious, in some ways, just as a doctor, to get your thoughts and maybe even your advice on this. The way that we learn is by watching our professors do it and sort of emulating people that we think do it well. I think it's reflective of our personalities. Like I wrote on the cover of your book, after thinking about this for a long time, I said this is an exercise in compassion. There is an inflection point between hope and honesty. Sounds like this doctor you're talking about, the hematological oncologist, wanted to be hopeful and wanted to be honest as well. But finding that point, Jonathan, is hard. How did he do? And I don't know, I'm not asking you to malign him, but how do you think people should find that point of inflection?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I told you my story of how I was diagnosed, when you said, you were sorry, about the whole thing, that right there, and the fact that you did blurb the book, and exercising compassion, to me, that's one of the magic words is compassion. And the first doctor I saw, the orthopedist, he delivered the news with a sort of human compassion and an element of, I could feel his compassion. I could feel that he cared and that he was hurt and honestly probably a little scared himself. And even though I've been told by other physicians that you're sort of sometimes, depending, trained to not display that upset or that concern or that human side of fear or compassion, I'm going to say I disagree. I think that that's exactly what makes the difference. And the same with my oncologist, the first oncologist I just spoke about. He is a very warm and friendly guy, and I could feel his caring, and the same is true of non-physicians. I get asked a lot, if I know somebody who has a diagnosis like yours, what should I say? What should I do?
Right.
And, I can tell you what you shouldn't do is, offer solutions, especially if you're not a particularly well-informed, if you're not a physician or, otherwise well-informed. That doesn't tend to be helpful. And telling a story about somebody or yourself who's gone through something similar in that moment, I understand people mean well, and I get there's some value in that, but that to me isn't the most helpful. And what I always think about is one of my colleagues, a week or two after my diagnosis, and I went back to work and people knew what was going on, he said to me, "I'm really sorry, that sucks." And I thought, that's just about perfect. It's just that simple. You just want to feel that people care and are sympathetic and are sorry. I've done the same thing myself. Believe me, I've said the wrong thing to people. Even after my diagnosis, I've said the wrong thing. But I think just a basic compassion goes a long way.
Before we continue, I think the audience is going to want to know, how are you now? How are you doing?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm well at the moment. The basic story of my 20 plus year experience here has been that multiple myeloma is not curable, but it has proven, in my case anyway, it has turned out to be treatable. Not curable, but treatable. And that, as I mentioned earlier, many new treatments have come along since I got sick. In fact, it's been uncanny. I didn't even realize this myself until I had to put the timeline together in a precise way for the book. But some of these new treatments came along within months or maybe a year and a half of when I needed them. So basically my pattern has been I go in and out of remission. I get sick, they treat me with one thing. I go into remission sometimes for a very long time, sometimes for a short time, sometimes a full remission, sometimes a partial remission. I get sick again, they treat me with something else, and so on. And that's happened, I've lost count, more than 10 or 12 times, those cycles.
And are you quite sick at these times before you get a new treatment?
It's varied all across the board. One of the reasons I'm here is because I'm monitored so closely. I'm scanned and blood checked go through a battery of blood tests every 3 to 6 months, depending on how actively sick I am. And there have been times where they've caught something so early that I don't feel, I'm not terribly sick. And there are other times where things have advanced to a point where I've been quite sick. So that pattern has gone on and went on until the summer of 2023, when, to your point, I came out of remission. I was quite sick again and in need of by far the biggest treatment I've had to date, which is this mind-blowingly futuristic treatment called CAR T therapy. Yeah. But I had that treatment 2 summers ago, which was very arduous, very risky. But I came through it successfully and have been, knock wood, in a full remission ever since. In fact, just 2 weeks ago now, I had my most recent set of scans and blood tests. And you talk about getting emotional about this. Now I'm going to get emotional a good way, because my wife and I were at my current oncologist's office, and it was by far the best checkup I've had in many, many years. And we were astonished. Like, we didn't go expecting to know that. We didn't know what was going to happen at that appointment exactly. But it's not a stretch to say it was sort of miraculous. We were almost dumbfounded with how good my numbers are and how good my scans look. And the chances are I will come back. So I'm not getting out ahead of myself. But one of the things you learn, and you talk about this being a book about more than just cancer, there are definitely life lessons you learn from this kind of experience. And one of them is just take everything one day at a time, as they say, and that was a really good day, and who knows what tomorrow will bring. But, right now we're feeling pretty good.
Hooray.
Thank you.
You write in the book, I think that's very interesting, that most cancer stories sort of take on two forms. And the form is he or she fought valiantly and they lived, or he or she fought valiantly and they died. But there is a third story to tell. And I'm curious, first of all, just that line, if you can reflect on that, but also the third story. What is it? How do you define it?
Yeah, and this is one of the things when you asked early on, why I wanted to write this book. This is another reason I wanted to write the book, is that my experience is different in some ways, not from everybody's, but it's relatively unusual. And, most people have one of two outcomes. They're either unfortunately not able to beat this disease and it takes their life, or they're cured. And that's how most of us think, is in that kind of black and white either or way. That, again, that's sort of just how humans are wired. And that's how we think about cancer typically, I think. Because of all these breakthroughs in cancer treatment, and the same with some other serious chronic illnesses, there's a whole category of people now who are in this in-between world where they're neither sick or well, but they're living with a permanent condition for longer than any of us ever did before when we received this kind of diagnosis. And I came up with this term that I call us cancer zombies. So, zombies are half dead and half alive, we know from many movies and television shows. Cancer zombies are half sick and half well, and doomed to be that way forever, the same way zombies are doomed to be half alive forever. So there's this new category of people, that honestly is unique in human history. And that's another reason I wanted to write this book, is to help those people who aren't in this category understand who we are and what life is like for us, and those people who are in this category to sort of recognize them and say, hey, we're this strange group of people, and this is what our lives are. This is what my experience of this is like. And, I've been lucky enough to hear from quite a few people that, they appreciate that and relate to the fact that I'm speaking up about or speaking out for this group of people in a way that makes them feel seen and heard, as the expression goes, and that they can relate to.
You sort of keep with that theme, and you alluded to this in your own book, which, by the way, everyone should read this book. I love the book. It's about your journey, but I think it's actually about a lot more than that, about how we just think about uncertainty in our lives overall. And as I think you wrote at some point, there was a lot of uncertainty for you around this cancer diagnosis, but life is uncertain. What do they say? The only certain things are death and taxes, right? Everything else has some degree of uncertainty to it. But keeping on this theme of communication, now you have to tell your family after you get this news from your oncologist. And I'm curious how you decided to present it. And were you hopeful? And did you try and project that hope upon your family?
Yeah, I was just fumbling my way through it, to be honest. You're living in a state of permanent uncertainty, with a sword hanging over your head is another of the analogies I use, your whole life, is that there's this uneasy sense, even at good times, even at times like now when I'm in a full remission and just got a good checkup. I know this disease is coming back. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that is a very strange and difficult thing to live with. As you said earlier, we all face uncertainty. And this is where, again, I think the book is applicable to everybody. Doesn't matter if it's medical uncertainty or economic uncertainty or your job or, whatever it may be. Living with that uncertainty is something, whether we're conscious of it or not, we're all doing all the time. When you have a diagnosis like this, and that uncertainty is put very directly right in front of you all the time, sometimes with, the gravest of, in the gravest of ways, you learn a lot about uncertainty. You're constantly conscious of how uncertain life can be, and you need to learn how to cope with it, maybe in a way even more so than most people do.
There were so many fascinating things about the book, but this point that you're making, I think, was one of the most fascinating because, look, I drove to work today. I could have been in a wreck. I could have been killed, and that is something that happens. My middle daughter's on a plane right now. She's flying to see me. My point being, Jonathan, is that there is a lot of uncertainty, and yet for most of us, as we live our lives, we're not paralyzed by it. We may not even think about it, let alone be paralyzed by it. And then you have a diagnosis like this, and all of a sudden it becomes sort of the predominant force, as you're saying in your book. It brings it to the forefront. Has it affected how you evaluate risk in other parts of your life as well? Now that you're sort of, and I got to think about this cancer zombie term, by the way. I read that. I like it, and I really appreciate the fact that other people take something away from it. I still process that term a little bit because it is such a novel sort of term for me. Now that you sort of consider yourself a cancer zombie, do you evaluate risk in other parts of your life differently as well? Are you more careful?
I think if anything, it's made me less risk averse because of a couple of things. One, the very common experience that people who have life and death experience, brush with death have, whether that is a car wreck or, an illness or anything else. I have a much greater appreciation for how short life is. And so if I want to do something, whether that's something small, like call a friend or text a friend, or something big, like go on a trip to Alaska or something. So I tend to think to myself, A, I've got to do this right away because life is short. And B, if I've survived what I've now survived, I can probably handle more than I thought I could prior to this. I'm not as afraid of something going wrong in my life as I used to be because I've already stared down some pretty ugly stuff and managed to still be here. So I'm probably less risk averse. I'd say the thing that's maybe more interesting isn't necessarily how I evaluate risk, but how I cope with uncertainty. And I did a lot of research about this for the book. Spoke to a woman who's a sociologist at the University of California, Riverside, and she has made it her life's work to study this very subject of how people cope with uncertainty. And I learned a lot from her. Just quickly, a couple things. One, we're all terrible at dealing with uncertainty as humans. It's just not something we're wired for very successfully. And so I asked her naturally, well, what should people do? And she'd studied that also. And she said, simply distracting yourself can be good. We all know that. She said the best thing is sort of to do something that gets you into a flow state or the zone, as we say. For me, that's fly fishing. For other people, it could be yoga, baking, knitting, doesn't matter. Something that's deeply absorbing and sort of pushes all the other thoughts out of your mind because it's so engrossing. Your brain doesn't even have the space to process your fears and your worries and your anxieties. And then I said to her, well, what do? You're the expert. And she said, to tell you the truth, I'm terrible at it. And I said, well, that's not very encouraging. And she said, well, what I like to say to people is knowing how hard it is the most important thing. Because again, then you don't feel so alone. You don't feel like I'm doing something wrong because I'm so scared or I'm so anxious. And that thought has helped me a ton over the years. When I'm feeling very anxious or very afraid of or very uncertain about anything, I remind myself that everybody feels this and it's natural to be anxious or afraid or uncertain. It's human. It'll pass. And, yes, I use some of the other tricks and they help, but the best thing I've learned is that advice that, it's okay. It's okay to feel this way. It's going to pass.
This term again, cancer zombie, which I'm still, I've thought about this a lot since I read your book. I'm curious, how big a population do you think this is now? Because there's all these new cutting edge treatments. We've made all these strides in oncological care. It's a growing population, I would imagine, but how big do you think it is?
Yeah, I think you're talking about, easily hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions worldwide, because you're talking about any number of different cancers that are becoming more and more treatable. You're talking about other chronic illnesses that are becoming more treatable. And so, there aren't statistics on the matter. I'm not sure anyone besides me has even really thought of it exactly this way to count, but I think just, extrapolating from the number of people who have these illnesses and these new treatments that are keeping people alive longer and longer, it's certainly a growing number. And I think, as I say, my best guess would be somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions.
If you had a chance now, roughly now, 25 years later, 24 years later, in your state of life now, to give your younger self some advice based on everything you've learned and obviously the deep dive you did in writing the book, which causes you to be self-reflective in a way that maybe You had been, but not to this degree. What kind of advice would you give your younger self?
One is, don't be afraid to do whatever you want to do. Do it now. Life is short. Take advantage of your opportunities when you have them. There's the serenity prayer people talk about when they're in recovery from drug or alcohol addiction. Control the things you can control and try and accept the things you can't. I'd say, I'm not sure if that's the secret to life, but in my experience, it's maybe as close as I've come to discovering it. And in my case, what that means is, I have worked very hard and done everything to the best of my ability to stay well, and follow my doctor's advice and go to my checkups. And a lot of times, believe me, I don't want to go back for another round of screening, and it'd be easier just to say, I don't feel any active symptoms. I'm going to pretend I'm fine and, hope for the best. I control the things I can control, so to speak, best I can. And I go to those appointments, and luckily, in a couple of cases, I'm glad I have, because there was something going on, even though I didn't, have outward symptoms, and that's probably helped keep me here. And I also have tried anyway to get better at accepting the things I can't control, that right. When I do get bad news or, something else goes wrong in my life for that matter, not trying to grab every problem by the throat and shake it to death, that, sometimes it's better just to accept that this is happening to me, and, hopefully the best will happen. And if it doesn't, there's only so much I can do. I'd tell myself, I guess, you can handle more than you think you can. When I was first diagnosed, that day I described to you, there was no way I thought I could handle this. Your mind starts to race, of course, to, all the pain and suffering you might experience going through a serious illness like this, the side effects of chemotherapy, the images that pop into your head that we've seen in movies and television shows and read about in books about how difficult this can be. I thought to myself, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. And here I am, and I've managed to do it. I want to be careful here, because a lot of people say, well, it's so important to have a positive attitude when you are facing something like this. I agree it's important to have a positive attitude, but maybe not for the reasons people say all the time. Sometimes there's an implication of it's on you to, that if you're negative, that's going to have a bad effect on your own outcome. And that's a little bit like what you were talking about blaming the victim. I think that's an unfair burden to place on people who are sick. On the other hand, I do think I try and be optimistic and positive in my life, because it just makes my day-to-day life better. Whether it has an impact on my outcome or not is a different subject. But I do know that if I try and have a positive attitude, my day-to-day existence is that much better, to the extent that I can, Sure. So I guess what I would tell my younger self is, really bad things happen, and that sucks, but really good things can happen too. And as much as I've had to face all of the difficulties I've had to face with my illness, and they've been considerable and reached across many aspects of my life, here I am. I've got 2 great kids. I'm still married to my wife. I've got a good job. I, live in New York City, which is a place I love and find exciting and wonderful. And it's got a nice family, and I still fish and these other things. A lot of good things can happen to you too. So I don't think you can either look at life as strictly glass half empty or strictly half full. But I don't think you want to look at it necessarily as half empty all the time either.
Well, Jonathan, I'm just delighted to be able to speak to you like this. And, I really did enjoy the book. I read it almost entirely in one sitting. And, just this idea again of uncertainty, I think there's this quote, and it basically is somebody who's saying that there is this false confidence bred from the ignorance that we live in an uncertain world, and that people want to see black and white where they should rightly see gray. And we humans just aren't always comfortable with that. But I think your book reminded me that instead of trying to find certainty, trying to establish certainty in the world, sometimes we need to get more comfortable living in the gray. We need to get more comfortable living in the world of uncertainty, as opposed to constantly trying to modify an inherently uncertain world. And it's tough. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying, like that one doctor said to you, that your therapist, that they're necessarily good at it, but But I think it's important to be comfortable with uncertainty, and your book was a great reminder of that. So thank you again for writing it. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. It's all very kind of you to say, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I've really enjoyed it and appreciate it.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm a member of the family, so maybe we can see each other in person sometime soon. Maybe go fly fishing or something.
That would be fantastic. You have a standing invitation anytime. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.